Hello and welcome to another interview for our Facebook page, When Boys Read, Great Things Happen. And I am beyond ecstatic today because today I get to interview one of my great heroes. And I know that sounds sappy to say that, but that's all right. Um, I I am just thrilled to be able to talk with Jonathan Maberry and then to get him to give us some ideas and maybe talk about his work. And I have to tell you, I'm just thrilled. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me on. And it's it's fun to talk about this book and the long, strange journey it took to write it and what's happened since. So, thanks for having me here.
So the first thing I'm going to ask is because I'm currently a college professor, and I saw you did that for 14 years at
Mhm.
Temple.
Yeah,
And so there's life after being a professor.
yeah, there is. Though it's funny, I was actually a teacher, an instructor, not a professor. I didn't actually get to. I was teaching in the phys ed department, teaching women's self defense, the history of martial arts, and also jujitsu, and did that
Oh,
for
wow.
14 years. And it was next to being a writer, it was the most fun I ever had because most of my other jobs were a little less savory, like being a bouncer, being a bodyguard, getting stabbed and run over and chopped with a meat cleaver. That was no fun. And
Somehow I think that probably ended up in one of your books somewhere, didn't it?
a lot of what I did during those years shows up in various characters' experiences in my books, both for teens and adults. Yes.
And I will tell you honestly that in researching before doing this, before talking with you today, there's a lot of good information out there about you. And at least, I think it's good information. There was one from the high school that you graduated from where you graduated, and they a very extensive interview with you. And I thought that was terrific. And I'll provide that link on the Facebook page as well. But I just want to hear. So tell me about how you grew up where? In Philadelphia, right?
Yeah, I grew up in the Kensington section of Philadelphia, which in the 60s and 70s when I was a kid was a very bad neighborhood. A lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol, a lot of child abuse, including in my own home, a lot of violence of various kinds. So it was not the kind of place you want to look back fondly on.
Sure.
But I also, I've met so many friends, and also a lot of the teens I've met across the country talk about this book. A lot of us all started from the same kind of a furnace, and as much as it's not fun to go through it, it actually can inform a lot of who we become in positive ways over the years.
Sure. And I think I have a good friend who was a school guy all of his life. He just retired a couple of years ago, but he got his start on the mean streets of Los Angeles and actually ended up going into the Marine Corps, became a sniper, was in Vietnam, and then went to college to become a teacher and administrator and spent the rest of his life doing that. And I think those are the kind of stories that inspire me, and hearing, some of what you've gone through.
Well, it's an interesting process because sometimes negative things can turn you dark, can twist you, and they talk about nature versus nurture, but there is a third element that's often left out of that equation, and that third element is, I think, the most important. It's nature versus nurture versus choice.
Right.
And my brother and I both had the same upbringing, as did our four sisters. He went in the military, he served in Vietnam, a couple tours. But he kind of followed a little bit of the same direction as of my father. He's unfortunately marked by intolerances of various kinds, and I had the same upbringing. But actually, there are some things that happened because of reading that kind of changed that frequency for me. Quick example of that. So the neighborhood I grew up in, Kensington, is not only a blue collar, low income blue collar neighborhood. It was also one of the most infamous racist neighborhoods in the country. There's actually been articles written about back in the day, about White Town USA and so on. I didn't meet a person of color till seventh grade, so my neighborhood was intensely racist. The Ku Klux Klan met in the houses
Oh, wow.
of my father, and my friends. So that was the environment I was born into, and I might have become another kind of clone of my father had it not been for a character I encountered in a comic book. I
No,
was
really.
reading Fantastic Four comics back in the late 60s, and they had introduced the character of the Black Panther, who was, my father had told me all the things that Black people could not be: intelligent, world leaders, scientists, etc. And here's a character who was a scientist and king and a superhero and a noble character. And of course, showing that comic to my father got me belted. It's typical response as a
Wow.
kid.
Yeah.
But when I got to seventh grade, I showed one of those comics to my librarian in middle school, and she said, "Well, that particular issue of the comic, is about apartheid." And I'm like, "What's that?" So she explained apartheid to me. Then she
Oh,
explained the
wow.
laws and everything else. Because of my exposure to that character and asking questions of somebody whose agenda was not based on fear and intolerance, I wound up getting my eyes open to the realities of racism and the propaganda I was going through at home. That changed the course of my life. Now, I could have chosen to be like my father. The choice was there for me, but I
Sure.
chose not to. I chose to keep reading and expanding my mind. And so it is not at all unreasonable to say that the Black Panther character from a comic book saved my life. Ironically, you roll forward to the early 2010s, actually it was 2009, I think it was. Reginald Hudlin, who was the founder of BET Network,
Right. Sure.
so he had been writing the Black Panther comic, and he had heard me talk about my childhood, and he pitched to the bosses at Marvel that I should then come on to become the writer of Black
Oh,
Panther
wow.
after him, which I
That's
did.
cool.
So I think my father would be spinning in his grave at about warp 9 had he lived long enough to see that.
And I think the other thing, and in the book that we have coming out about getting boys to read, I think one of the things that you talked about right then is so important, and that is the role that a charismatic adult can have in the life of a young person. And it took that librarian to open your eyes through a comic book.
A comic
And
book.
she also allowed you to read a comic book, which
Yes,
that
encouraged.
is so cool.
Yeah, she was one of those forward-thinking people. Now, mind you, this was 1970, 71,
Right.
right? She was one of those forward-thinking people that saw the value, the literary value of comic books, and the fact that comics were able to tackle societal issues, especially Marvel comics at the time, racism, drug use, and other things. They were able to tackle those in a pretty unflinching way when other companies did not. I am so sorry. I thought I had turned my ringer off. Let me grab that real quick. My agent is calling. I'll call that call later. I do apologize.
Oh, no
But
problem.
the comics tackle tough issues, and they did it in a way that didn't preach about it, but gave
Right.
the readers a chance to form their own thoughts. And that's what happens with good books. They allow us readers, no matter what age we are, to think for ourselves, but with enough information to be able to work that through in our minds.
And I think the cool thing that I see is that we are getting to the point now, and again, my focus is on getting boys to read, because in the school setting, here's what we see every time we look. If you look at test scores and reading and all that, and I hate tests, by the way, I despise those standardized tests, and I think they should all be abolished. But when we look at them, the one thing that we see that stands out all the time, constantly, is that boys score lower than girls in reading.
Yes.
Now, I was an elementary principal for 25 years. So I look back and I think it wasn't the fact that boys couldn't read, it was that they didn't read.
Yeah. And we weren't encouraged to read. We were encouraged to do other things.
That's right.
The girl's going to stay home and read, the boy's going to go out and do stuff. And that kind of social programming is it's indefensible in terms of its value to who we are and how we're raised.
Right. And so as we start looking at then you went from, and if I understand now, according to this one writer, you're an 8th degree black belt, and I couldn't even pronounce the kind of martial art. Could you say, I mean?
Yeah, Shinawara Ryu Jiu-Jitsu.
Okay.
Jiu-Jitsu is the Japanese, unarmed Japanese art. Well, it's mostly unarmed. Developed by the samurai originally for when they didn't have a sword, the sword broke or whatever.
Okay.
So I studied that form of it. I am in my 58th or 59th year of it now.
Outstanding.
So I'm retired, But yeah, jujitsu, I got involved in that because I was getting abused at home. And I knew at some point I needed to defend myself. But I
Wow.
wound up learning great lessons of discipline and uh, self-respect that I was not learning anywhere else.
Well, I grew up not too far from you. I grew up in Baltimore.
Okay.
So one of the things that I'm thrilled about, and I'm going to start at the very beginning with the Joe Ledger series, is that he was a detective in Baltimore. And I think that, I read everything I can get my hands on about Baltimore, any Baltimore stories. So, um, and I was thrilled the way that you brought Joe into the Rot and Ruin series. So I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but
Well, Joe's my ubiquitous character. He fits anywhere, and he's been in 3 different book series so far. He's in the Joe Ledger series, of course, and the new one comes out July 13, Relentless. He's in the Dead of Night series, which takes place 15 years after whenever the last Joe Ledger book will be. And that's the series about how the world ends in a zombie apocalypse. It's Joe's possible future because we already play with
nice.
possible futures in that series. And then 14 years after the Dead of Night series is the Rotten Ruin series, where Joe is now in his 60s and still out there fighting because he's the one character that in almost any given scenario is going to walk out of there.
All right, so let me ask you this question, because from what I understand about writers who are exceptional in fiction writing, often their major character is a reflection of themselves. So are you Joe Ledger?
Um, Not entirely. There's more of me in a couple of other characters. My character Monk Addison, who appeared in several short stories and a couple of novels, has a lot of me in him. But also in my first 3 novels, the Ghost Road Blues trilogy, kind of
And
2
I
different.
have that on my iPad right now. I'm reading it.
Well, that series, the character of Malcolm Crowe and the character of Mike Sweeney are both based on different parts of my life. Mike Sweeney is a little bit of who I was as a kid, though his evil, violent father is actually a whitewashed version of my own. I mean, which was just gives you an idea of what my home life was. And the character of Crowe, what I did with him is I had martial arts in my life from an early point, so I never went completely off the rails, despite all the trauma that happened. Crowe got involved in martial arts later, as did Joe Ledger. So with Crowe, I wanted to explore what my life might have been had I not had that shelter, that discipline. So he became a substance abuser and so on, which he eventually, got clean from. I never went down that road, but I could see that without things like martial arts, without things like some of the people in the book world that I was so fortunate to meet early on, they gave me a structure, a life path to follow. But I wanted to explore what would happen if someone like me had not had that, and that's the
Oh,
character from that.
that's incredible.
In the
So,
Joe Ledger series, by the way, the character I feel the most personal identity with is Rudy Sanchez, his
okay.
therapist.
So how did you decide? I mean, you said in an interview I read, you knew in high school you wanted to be a writer. How did that happen?
I knew in kindergarten I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know
Wow.
exactly what that meant. Before I could read and write, I was telling stories with toys. So I was always telling stories. It was born wanting to do that. In high school, I found a focus for it. I wanted to become a newspaper reporter. I wanted to, this is shortly after the Watergate thing,
Oh,
and
yeah.
Woodward and Bernstein were superheroes. I wanted to be one of those guys. But what happened is, in the course of going to college, I kept changing my focus on writing. I actually went into I never did newspaper writing. I went into magazine features. Did that part time for decades. Wrote college textbooks for my own classes and for friends who taught classes who were good teachers but not necessarily good writers. And didn't really even think about fiction until I was well into my 40s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I did my first novel kind of on a lark to see, well, what had happened is I'd written a book after doing a whole bunch of martial arts books. I wanted to close out a 4-book contract I had with a small press, and the 4th book was not specified what it was going to be. And the publisher assumed it was going to be martial arts, but I proposed a book on the folklore of supernatural predators, vampires, werewolves, and so
Oh,
on
sure.
throughout history. Because my grandmother introduced me to that. She was a wonderfully creepy old lady. And if you can imagine Luna Lovegood as an old lady,
Oh, yeah.
that's my grandmother.
Oh,
Okay.
wow.
So I wound up writing a book called The Vampire Slayer's Field Guide to the Undead, but I did it under a pen name, Shane MacDougall, because the publisher was afraid my martial arts readers would think I'd gone round the twist. Turns out that book was enormously popular, much more than my martial arts books.
Wow.
And while writing that, I kind of got interested in reading fiction with folkloric versions of the monsters because they're so much different than the Hollywood versions, but couldn't find any. So I tried to write a novel to see if I would enjoy it. Turns out it's what I enjoy most of every kind of writing I've ever done.
Now, here's a question. I've done a lot of writing over the years,
Sure.
but I've never ever fiction. I don't think I have a story like that. Now I know I've watched the workshops and I've attended the writing workshops, and there's a story in everybody. Well, I haven't found mine yet, except that school related kinds of things, and I'm very much into those. But in your books, the thing that I was fascinated, one of the things I was fascinated with was the way that you wove in martial arts into the fighting, and the fights never seemed the same.
They never are the same.
So here's my question. How many books now? I'm 38, 39, 40.
How many have I written so far?
How many books altogether? Yeah.
I finished my 43rd novel 2 weeks ago.
Oh my word.
Actually, I'm sorry, the 41st novel 2 weeks ago. I'm working on my 42nd now.
So how do you not put it all, I'm afraid as a principal and as a college professor, I feel like I tell the same stories all the time to different kids, And when it's in print, how do you do that?
Well, there are some stories that by themselves are evergreen, and you don't want them necessarily to change. But when you're writing fiction, especially when you've become aware that you have a fairly dedicated fan base that's going to follow you through, you always want to make it as fresh as possible. And the fun thing about that with the creative process, and I teach workshops on how to write fight scenes, by the way. So when we explore this question, every possible story. Fight scene can come from a different direction. So in one story, Joe Ledger can fight, two different guys. And if there's one fight where he's fighting actually three guys in a cemetery, lots of room to move around. That same fight had happened in an elevator, it would be a completely different fight because the opportunities to move, part of what's called the technical philosophy of martial arts, requires a different set of reactions given the circumstance, proximity, ability to flee, which you don't have an elevator. The advantage of the elevator walls become a weapon you can use, but also something that can be used against you. So once you start adding a circumstance and an environment to something, there's a limitless number of changes. And then with any group, any two combatants, it is unlikely to have two equally matched combatants meet in a story. So what's the inequality? Does one person want it more? Does one person have their gun out already? Is one person injured? Each time you add a new element to it, it changes. From that point on, the story, the fight scene diverges, because if it starts from a different point, it can't end, it can't flow to the same place. Even if you have a winner at the end, there still has to be new things happening.
So do you actually go, let's say you're writing about a fight in an elevator. Do you go into an elevator and look at it, or do you do this all in your head?
I do it in my head. Sometimes I will get up and coordinate just to make sure that spatial relations work. But I generally don't go to an elevator to do that. Though I have at times, if I'm doing a scene outside, I will walk around a little bit and just kind of look at, because some things trigger your eye. Like if I was writing, I'm looking out the window right now of my apartment. If I were writing a fight scene set right outside, well, I've got trees, I've got mulch on the ground. That can become something you can kick in somebody's face, be a distraction. The trees can allow you to dodge, hide behind, throw somebody into, brace to throw a kick. Just by looking at the environment, different techniques and storytelling moments kind of occur to me. So I think of the environment often first and then put the characters into it. Or if I know I have two protagonists I need to fight, where can I put them to make the fight the most interesting?
Outstanding. All right, so now let me jump into another topic, which is a really hot topic today. But you started talking about this long ago. In the very first of the series, Rot and Ruin, you had a very mixed cast of characters. And now that's trendy. Everybody's realizing, okay, we haven't used enough diverse groups of people. We haven't included, but you've done that. Why? How did you know 12 years ago that that should be a focus?
Well, because, I ever since my eyes were open as a kid, they stayed open. And, the world is not painted in one color.
That's true.
And differences in skin color are not the only differences. With my African American friends, growing up African American, even if you're, have the shelter to a degree of affluence, there's still the fact that you are the wrong color for some people to feel safe around. So they're going to have that tension has to be there. And even when you have people of different colors um, who are friends, there is still the awareness of cultural difference, racial difference,
Sure.
family differences, the way in which, like I have some friends, I lived for a short period of time in New Iberia in Louisiana. And the way African Americans are
There's
treated
another
there,
great writer that comes from down that way.
James Lee Burke, yeah. That's actually where that's how I found out about James Lee Burke, because everyone
Wow.
down here talks about James Lee Burke. And he's now my favorite living writer, which is
Oh, I
great.
love his books.
Yeah.
Outstanding books.
But just awareness is real, and the mistake a lot of writers make, and I'm not going to throw stones here, but is that when they have a person of color or a person of a different cultural background, sometimes they put them in the story and then completely ignore any opportunity to address
Exactly.
that
That's
person's
right.
heritage. But that's what makes the character rich. It's what makes life itself rich, because we are each different, and we bring with us so many stories that can be told. And we're fools, and we cheat ourselves not to listen to those stories and not to want to tell those stories. In the new Rotten Ruin books, in fact, the main character is a 15-year-old bisexual Latina. Now, I'm not 15 years old. I'm not bisexual, and I'm not a Latina. So in order to write that, in order to write her, there's some people rely on, like, they do a draft and then they give it to a sensitivity reader to be corrected. I think that's cheating on your homework.
I do too. I agree with you.
Yeah, I do a lot of interviews with folks whose experience is different than mine, so I can ask them, like in one of my adult novels recently, there was a romance between a lesbian and a bisexual woman. So you have two female characters with experiences different than mine. I interviewed a lot of people who have that experience. I don't want to write it from my even well-intentioned straight male viewpoint. I want to find out what they think, what they feel, because that will allow me to then construct the storyline, not have to fix the storyline.
All right.
And
And
that's how it works.
that's powerful. And I think it's also a good recommendation to people who want to write. And it's kind of interesting because part of my history was that I started this book club for boys in the school, and we created a section in the library, which was, we put boys read over top of it in big letters, not because we were not letting anybody else check out books there, but because the boys needed that extra help to find the section.
Sure.
I recognized a long time ago that boys pick books out differently than girls do in the school library. So we made it simple. But one of the cool things was, I started a book club after that. One of my kids, I found Rotten Ruin, and I started reading it, and it's probably a little heavy for like a fourth grader, but yeah. I had fourth graders that were all over this book, and they just loved it. So the thing I'm asking you, you've got books that span everything from younger children all the way up through adults. How do you do that in your head? How do you decide?
Well, for Rotten Ruin, like a little backstory on Rotten Ruin. Rotten Ruin was not intended for teenagers originally. There was a fellow, one of my writer buddies, Christopher Golden, had been doing an editing anthology for Macmillan called The New Dead. And it asked each contributor to write a story in which we would go outside of our personal comfort zone to tell that story. And this is going way early in my fiction career. And up till that point, I had never written a story with a teenage protagonist, nor had I ever written a post-apocalyptic story. And I thought about, I wanted to do something after the zombie apocalypse. And I kind of remembered how I used to think about these things when I was a teenager. Because I saw Night of the Living Dead, the very first of
Oh,
the
yeah.
zombie films. I saw it on its release when I was 10 years old, October 2nd, 1968. And I've been thinking about zombies ever since. So when I wanted to write that book, I knew I wanted to write a story for um, younger readers, but I didn't think middle grade readers were the right audience for it, because I knew there was going to be action, there's going to be blood, there's going to be romance, and I wanted romance in it. And middle grade books don't usually focus on romance. Because, when I was 12, 13, 14, that's when I started getting interested in girls and, dating
Sure.
and so on. But also, I grew up rough, and I wanted to explore that. So the story really was suited for that age range, but it was written for adults. My agent was the one that told me that it reads like a contemporary young adult novel. And when I went in to rewrite it, to revise it into the novel, I actually didn't change much, because I remember how much I read when I was that age and the kinds of conversations I had with my friends.
Oh, yeah.
People think if you're 12, 13, 14, 15, you're a kid. No, you're not. You're in training to be an adult, and you already
Right.
have complex, deep thoughts. Any writer who writes down to kids is a fool. Any writer who knows kids writes up to them.
That's right. I agree. And that's a wonderful thing, because what I see in encouraging boys to read and putting a whole variety of books in front of them, that eventually they're going to move away from some of the lighter quality books, and they're going to move to something that demands more of their attention. And
Yeah.
I think that's a great progression. I love watching that.
And also, they want books that have a doorway for them to step in and embody the character. Where a lot of fiction, because they know the audience, the biggest audience in reading is girls, a lot of young adult fiction is tailored toward girl readers, with boys as supporting characters. But I know when I was a boy, I wanted to read stories where I could embody the protagonist. I wanted to be
Exactly.
that protagonist, and it was harder for me to do that with a female character than it was with a male character. So, I was writing. I wrote Rotten Ruin when I switched from the novella to that I had published originally to the full novel. That was written for the me of that age, the 15-year-old me. I wrote the book I would have read, and that comes from
I
another
like
thing that
that.
happened.
That's a great thought, by the way.
Yeah, and it comes from another thing that happened around the same time, as when I met that librarian in middle school.
Right.
She was the secretary for two different clubs of professional writers, one that met in Philly and one that met in New York infrequently. It's writers from all over the country who were launching books or who would come to New York because that was the center of the book world. And this is way pre-internet, 1970, 71, 72, 73. So that's, if you were launching a big book, you went to New York. And so she would drag me along to the meetings. And in the New York crowd, I got to meet and be mentored by Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson
Oh,
for
my word.
years. And it was Bradbury who gave me that great bit of advice. He said, don't just write the book you would read, write the book you would go out of your way to hunt down and read. Write the book that's calling to you so loudly you must answer. And that's what I do. I write that book.
And you've been very successful at it. Now, I'm going to tell you the reason that I am thrilled to, for one, you're the most approachable author I think I've ever met.
Because I'm a book nerd.
Well, I am too.
Nerd first, writer second.
Well, I'm definitely a book nerd, and my wife would tell you that as well. I am definitely a book nerd. And so I'm really into the whole, I'll find an author I like and I'll read every single thing they've ever written. And so I do that, but I love the fact that in working with boys, especially, we start to lose them at the 4th and 5th grade level.
Mm-hmm.
We teach them in kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade how to read, and we push all those buttons, all the miraculous studies that people have done and all the programs they sell and all this stuff. And I'm not a big fan of all the kinds of programs. I'm a fan of, let's teach them the mechanics and then give them something to read that they're interested in. And when I finally understood that one of the things that we were seeing is that most elementary teachers predominantly are female, and that's still true. And so when a boy goes into a classroom and he says, hey, I can't find a book to read. So what does the teacher recommend? Often she will recommend a book that she enjoyed when she was a little girl.
Yeah.
and that doesn't necessarily get their attention. So I like what you just said about you write books that the 15-year-old you would have written. And let me ask you this: do you know the impact that you have on guys reading?
I didn't at first, and a couple of incidents changed that in ways that affected me quite greatly. What happened is I had gone up to a teen book festival in Washington State, Eastern Washington State, 2011, I think it was. And we were in Pasco, Washington, but also had gone over to Umatilla, Oregon, visiting some schools. And it's a pretty economically depressed area there. There'd been, of all things, a bioweapons lab in Umatilla that was closed down after the international agreements, which killed the economy there, right? But visiting some of the schools, you know, you see these kids who are growing up rough, you know, looking for a way out. And I met some really incredible teachers who were explaining that books are that portal. You know, you can imagine your way out. You can learn your way out of the area, way out of the problem. One thing that in particular that caught me, there was a librarian who was also somehow, I'm sorry, yeah, he was a librarian who was also somehow the school disciplinarian. I'm not sure how that worked, but when the kids were in detention, they would have to come in and sit in a room in the library. There would be a rack of books there. They could read the books, and there were always questions based on each chapter of the books in that shelf. If they were able to answer the questions, proving that they had read the book, they can get time shaved off their detention.
Oh, okay.
So there was one young man who spent a lot of time in detention. He came from bad home. He had rough grades. You know, it was a bit of a problem child. And the book he picked was Rotten Ruin. He liked the cover. And he wound up spending so much time in detention over a period of weeks that he read the entire book. And then he had a buddy of his go into the library to get the next book because he was way too cool to go into a library himself. You know,
right?
You know, and he wound up starting a guys' book club eventually because of that.
Oh, that's cool.
Book. He graduated. He was a D- student when he started. He graduated as a B- student. And I got to meet him again when I was back there a couple of years ago, and he's now a graduate. And he went from someone who was a victim of his life circumstances, someone who had taken agency over his life circumstances. And the fact that started with my book, I have tears in my eyes telling that story. It was probably the most powerful moment of my career. And then Rotten Ruin went on to win statewide awards, the Nutmeg, the Cricket, the Mason, and a bunch of others for that very reason, because it got reluctant readers to read, and not only read my books, to keep reading.
Right. It opened that door.
And it's funny because even on my, there's something I used to say when I would go to schools to talk to kids, and it's actually on these book plates that I send if somebody needs my signature, but they already have the book. Knowledge is power. Books contain knowledge. Read, become powerful. And it was something I said off the cuff in a talk once, and I now it's become my catchphrase because I learned my superpowers from books.
I know that when I started talking, the way I even discovered who you were was Scholastic found out about, I got through a strange set of circumstances. Scholastic Book Fairs found out that I was a principal in Northeast Indiana. That's about, it's not really in the mainstream of a lot of things. And one of the vice presidents, her mother was best friends with a professor that I now work with at Ball State. And I had been her student, and they were looking for a principal. So she said, "Oh, you need to get Mike." That was it. That was how deep the thought was. So I started hanging out with Scholastic on their National Principals Advisory Board.
Cool.
And then during that same time, another friend of mine and I started boys' book clubs in our schools. And so when Scholastic found out about it, they said, "Oh, this is great. You need to tell this story." So they started sending me around the country. And then they would turn me loose in the book fair before I spoke and say, "Take any books you want and use them as examples." So I would say, have 2 big tables up there because I use a lot of examples. This was always one of the books, always. And what was so cool to me, I was not a zombie guy. I wasn't interested in zombies. Didn't like you said one time you were 10 years old or how I, it was doing nothing for me. But after speaking and holding this book up so many times and saying, this is the kind of thing that gets a guy's attention, I was flying home and I'm thinking, I don't have a book to read. And I feel that panic. When I don't have a book to read, I feel a panic.
I feel your pain.
And so I started reading it and I said, whoa, this is amazing. And so as soon as I got home, I ordered the rest of them and read through all of them. Now I still have the last two to catch up on. But the cool thing for me was that it gave me an opportunity to practice what I was telling everybody else to do. And what I appreciate so much is that it's not just a zombie story. You have real characters and you have very strong females in the book as well. And I think that's terrific because it's not just a bunch of, hoodlums. It's not a bunch of hoodlums running around doing crazy stuff. There's a purpose, even in the midst of despair,
Yeah, and that's important because we tend to polarize our characters too. If there's a strong female, then they try to make the male characters weak. If there's a strong male, they try to make the female characters helpless. And that's nonsense. Strength, doesn't need to be established through somebody else's weakness. It needs to be established through that person's strength.
Right.
And why they're strong and how they're strong and how they are also vulnerable in different areas too. Nobody is strong in every way, every direction. That's impossible. And nor should it be propagandized as possible, because it's not. I mean, I'm a tough guy. I'm, martial artist. I'm 6'4", but I have my vulnerabilities too. The strengths are there to compensate and protect the vulnerabilities, not to ignore them.
Absolutely.
And with female characters, not only did I grow up with four sisters, older sisters, I also have written, I've taught women's self-defense for decades. I know how tough women can get. Oh boy, do I know. I've got plenty of scars just from being a teacher teaching women's self-defense. And I have a lot of respect for anyone who is on the road to find and explore their own strengths and to find and understand their own weaknesses. That kind of journey starts young and it stays with you your whole life as long as you keep your eyes open and your mind open.
So Jonathan, if you could give a word of advice to principals and teachers about how right now to get their boys involved in reading, what would you say to them?
Oh boy. First off, I would get a couple of, I would see if I could track down a couple of recent graduates from that school who are readers and have them come in and talk about what the reading did to them, because they're closer to the group. Educators, one of the challenge we have as educators is they expect us to read.
Right, exactly.
Finding people who read because of something. When I was a kid, I knew that if I did not read, if I did not get, in my younger voice, it was smart enough, but really was educated enough. If I did not educate myself out of that neighborhood, I would still be in that neighborhood, probably working in a bad job, probably having some of the same hatreds in my soul that my father had. I just couldn't allow it. And school was not challenging me as much. I wanted to follow a bit of advice that Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson gave me, in that know more than you are taught. And the only way to do that is to read. And I learned all sorts of skills and sorts of useful information from books. Some of it, was applicable, some not, but it gave me more choices for how to live, how to become more powerful within my own life and how to continue being powerful. The reading gave me those choices where if I had not read, I would not know they were even options.
Right. Sure. Now, up to date, real life question. Did it cross your mind when this pandemic struck and it began to spread all over? I mean, knowing the kinds of books that you write, did the thought ever occur to you, this is like a government kind of thing and we're all going to be zombies by the time we get vaccinated?
It's funny. That did occur to me, but there are two things that happened at the early part of this pandemic that were weirdly prescient. One is that I had started a comic book in 2019 called Pandemica about a group of scientists funded by a racist group trying to find ethnic specific bioweapons to attack anyone who was not, their idea of the white dominant race, right? And at the same time, the government was being very, propagandized, like, it's not a problem, don't worry, it's not a problem, and it was a problem. And I wrote this in 2019, and the comic just started being published. I think the
Oh my word.
third issue came out just before COVID hit, and it wound up delaying the fifth issue for months because nobody was buying a story about the pandemic that was that close to home. The other thing is I had a TV series that launched on Netflix called V Wars, which was a vampire show about a plague and government obfuscation and intolerance and everything else. And it launched at the beginning of COVID and was not renewed because, it was a little too close to home.
Wow.
So yeah, I had thought a lot about, government involvement, pro and con, and political parties and corporate greed and everything else. And that plays a part in a lot of my novels, especially my adult fiction. So I would like to say I was surprised by what happened during COVID, but I was not surprised at all.
Right. Yeah.
Disappointed, not surprised.
Now, I have one final story to tell you. When the first time I ever spoke for Scholastic, I was in Dallas, and it was their first reading summit. And that, by the way, was the first time I ever saw Rotten Ruin, the book.
By the way, did you know Ed Macessa from Scholastic?
I don't think so. I don't know.
He ran most of the book fairs. I was curious if you knew him.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and I've got to meet, over the years, I've gotten to meet a number of them, but I'm doing this presentation, first time I'd ever done it, about getting boys to read. And a librarian in the back raised her hand, and she said, "I'm a librarian." And I thought, oh crap, I'm busted, because obviously I probably said something I shouldn't have said about boys choosing books or something. She said, "Do boys like vampire stories?" And I had your book right there. And I said, "Let me explain something to you about a lot of guys." I said, "Let me ask you a question. When a vampire kills somebody, how do they do it?" She said, "Well, they bite them in the neck." And I said, "Yeah, leaves, all vampire fiction, you see, they got the two little holes." And I said, "A lot of times you can't even see it." I said, "In a good zombie book, they rip arms off. They beat somebody over the head with their own arm." I said, "Now think about that for a minute and tell me, which one do you think boys probably more naturally fall toward?" Yeah. And of course, this was during the time of the whole, team, whatever, in vampire stories. Yeah. So, but you came out the winner in that discussion.
Thank you. A couple quick anecdotes one about vampires and another one about something else. The vampire one, I actually did a vampire series aimed at college age young men. And with that, I didn't do any of the, I don't romanticize the vampire. I don't like the romantic vampire. A story dealt with
you. That doesn't fit for me.
Yeah, and we're not the audience for it. I mean, Twilight was written for tween girls, and that's not us. It was never us, But this story, that it was a teenage boy, was 19, teenage young man, who had leukemia, and he was attacked by vampires. His only superpower was that the chemo drugs in his blood made the blood toxic to vampires. So not an upbeat story.
Oh, but that's a cool story. That's a cool twist.
Yeah, and it's being discussed for a possible TV series. It was published by Dark Horse. But the other thing about telling stories and about boys, when I was a kid, first of all, I have an unusual way that I dream. I have very lucid dreams. I remember my dreams in tremendous detail. I'm aware that I'm dreaming, but I'm always the observer, which is interesting. But when I was a kid, I kept a dream diary. And my dreams tend to be sequential, so that each night, when my dream ends, it'll pick up next night.
Oh, wow.
So I found my dream diary from when I was 11. And this whole series of dreams about aliens invading the earth, human kids trying to survive in an apocalyptic, wasteland, and then the human kids, me and my friends, encountering supernatural kids, a werewolf girl and others, and teaming up to fight back against the aliens, though, because even though we didn't like each other, we were afraid of each other, different races and so on, allegory for racism.
Sure.
We shared the planet, and suddenly our differences became became less important than what our similarities were. So I wound up pitching that as a middle grade series. I did 2 volumes of that, 2 books of that for Simon and Schuster called the Nightsider series. But it was me collaborating with my 11-year-old self, who was a very weird kid who had weird ideas. And back then I thought, I didn't want to tell my friends about my ideas because I was afraid of being criticized. So I wrote them down and kept them. And
Wow.
turns out, I am now professionally weird. So, yeah.
Well, Jonathan, I have to tell you, I so appreciate your writing. I love the diversity of it. The social justice themes just run through every single book.
Yeah.
And I think that, with keeping politics completely out, if a lot of the people who are in power could understand the simple lessons that are in some of your books, then it could change things so much.
It could, because they don't, these things have been politicized, but they shouldn't be. They're natural to beings, compassion, benevolence. In fact, this is something I when I go to visit boys and talk to them about reading, because of my martial arts background, I was taught the code of Bushido in Japanese martial arts. Mm-hmm. That's the code of the samurai. Nothing in there talks about killing anyone else. The code of Bushido is based on tenets of honesty, loyalty, benevolence, compassion, honor. All of those are the qualities that make you strong. So if the samurai, arguably some of the toughest men who have ever lived, if what they consider to be their most powerful values were compassion and honesty and loyalty, then maybe we should all take a look at that. It's something all boys can take a look at and go, wow, that's, you can't say that the samurai were anything but tough,
Oh, yeah.
And
exactly.
And here they talked about compassion. So social justice gets a bad rap with the social justice warrior thing, but think about what the 2 words mean: social justice, fairness. Looking for the ways in which we can connect as people, rather than trying to find ways to justify why we are apart. And the Rotten Ruin series, you have disparate characters, different experiences, and so on, who come together because they have a shared agenda, which is surviving in a meaningful way, not just
that's right.
Way. And it's what separates young adult fiction of this kind from adult fiction, because a lot of the adult fiction in the zombie genre is very downbeat. The humans usually lose at the end, or if there's just a couple of them left. And I kind of start with that vibe in Rotten Ruin, where the adults all have some degree of PTSD because their world collapsed. Their world failed. The kids, they intend to have a full life, and they'll go after it without the help of adults, as any group of kids really would. I don't think we'd turn into Lord of the Flies. I don't. I think we'd turn into Benny and Moore and his friends if things got that bad.
I agree. And you could do a whole lot worse than become Benny and his friends.
It's interesting with Benny, because I took a risk there in that he is not likable in the beginning of Rotten Ruin. He doesn't even like himself, which is why he's not likable to other people. And I gave him the opportunity to have his eyes opened, as mine were, and see the world for what it actually is, not what he assumed it was. And the Benny and Moore that we see in book 4 in Fire and Ash, and the Benny and Moore in Rotten Ruin, the whole story is about growth and growing into your power by embracing it, not by being fearless, because fearless is impossible, by being heroic, which is doing what you need to do even when you're afraid.
Wow.
And he becomes the hero of his own story.
That's outstanding. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your wisdom and the fact that you have a desire to get kids and young adults and even older adults reading. And I think there are a whole lot worse ways to spend a life.
Well, I do have what I believe now is the best job description in the world. I get to play inside my imagination all day long. And it's also, kudos to guys like you who are helping get these books in the hands of kids, and also talking to them as if they are intelligent readers, not just, oh, please read this and hope that your grades will get better. the grades are less important than that person evolving
Yes.
into someone who feels that they want to be them and they want to be the best version of them. And, teachers and librarians like you, I mean, you guys are on the front lines. So bravo.
Well, and I will tell you, one of the big reasons, and this is pretty cool to me, one of the big reasons that I was able to do some of the things that I was able to do at that elementary school was because we had a librarian who was not, because budget cuts and all that, she wasn't really a licensed librarian, but she loved the job and loved books and loved kids. And though she always reminded me that she was actually the library goddess. So, I had to call her the library goddess, but she set up all the books. She was thrilled to, humor me with my ideas about how to get boys. And then she said, this is about a year after we'd implemented the boys read section. She said, do you know our circulation went up by 1,500 books this year? I said, yes.
That's a win.
So
Win
that
for everybody.
is cool.
Yeah, that is a win-win-win, And librarians are superheroes. So
Yes, they are. Well, thank you very much, sir. And I will continue to follow you on Facebook. I enjoy doing that. And we will talk again.
yeah, and Mike, you can hit me anytime. And Rotten Ruin is in development for film right now with the people
No, really?
Yeah, it's being developed by Alcon Entertainment, the people who did Blade Runner 2049, Book of
Okay.
Eli, and who do the Expanse TV show. And one of the Marvel screenwriters is doing the script. I can't say who, it's under non-disclosure.
Sure, absolutely.
I love what they're doing with it. So maybe when that gets further along, I can come back and we can talk about taking, Benny and his crew to big screen.
Oh my word, that's exciting news. That's and we heard it here first. So there we go. All right, thank you very much, sir. It's so nice to get to talk to you.
Same here, Mike. Anytime.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye.